Welcome to the Barcode Podcast. My name is Ben Ponder. I'm your host. I'm really glad to have you here joining us today, along with my guest, Bryan Taylor of Drawn. I'm going to talk a little bit about Bryan's background in a minute, but I want to remind everybody that the Barcode Podcast is presented by Titanium CPG Insurance. Titanium protects forward-thinking consumer brands with a range of insurance products and risk management services that are designed specifically for natural and organic food and beverage brands. You can learn more online at titaniumcpg.com. So I want to turn to my old friend, who is not old, but I've known for a really long time. So Bryan Taylor, welcome to the studio.
Thank you.
Yeah, so glad to have you here. So Bryan is the founder, creative director of Drawn, which is an integrated, integrated marketing design agency based in Eugene, Oregon. They do some work around the country. Certainly, they have some clients here in Austin, and so I'm thankful to have him in the studio. Well, we captured him while he was in town. So we're going to kick it off with Bryan's best meal ever.
Best meal ever. I thought a lot about this, and really, I don't know how many times this actually happened, but I remember growing up, and Sunday night at our house, we had breakfast dinner, and usually we sat in front of the TV, and we broke two sacred rules right there. Okay. You never eat in front of the TV,
right? And
you don't have breakfast for dinner. And there was something really memorable about.
But breakfast for dinner is really nice.
It's really nice. So yeah,
I don't think I've ever regretted having breakfast for dinner. Let me say that.
No,
it's just a good meal.
No, I totally agree. If the Cowboys were on, we watched the Cowboys. If not, it was like that Disney family movie Sunday night thing. Right. We may have only done it twice, but I thought it was every Sunday night forever. Yeah, and so now I've been thinking about how I cook, and my kids love it when they ask for chef special, and it's basically you break every rule possible. You grab stuff out of the refrigerator, and then at the end of the meal, you have no idea how you made it.
But you've actually killed two birds with one stone there, right? You fed your family and you cleaned out the refrigerator a little bit, which is super helpful.
Yes.
So what's your best? Are there any legendary chef specials, at least in the eyes of your kids?
Yeah, and I couldn't tell you what they were because
they were all honestly, in the moment.
Yeah. Sometimes they're never make that again. But then every once in a while, it's they want a recipe for it, and I'm
there's
clueless.
There was no recipe. There never will be. No,
we won't have leftover pad thai that is 2 days old again. Or
that's right.
Whatever.
Exactly. And I think that you're a creative at heart. You always have been, and as long as I've known you, and I've known you for now over 2 decades, which probably makes both of us feel a little bit aged. But what I wanted to talk with you about today primarily, and we're going to talk about a number of different things, is how as someone who works with brands that are early stage to growth stage to more mature, how does a savvy brand think about design? How do you, again, let's assume that I'm a founder and I don't necessarily have some marketing or design background. Maybe I'm creative, maybe I'm not. Maybe I'm a person who's very kind of super left-brained. But at the same time, I recognize that there needs to be some design in my, if I have a brand or whatever it is. How do I begin to think about that as a non-professional designer, and as a client who maybe is either today or at some point in the future going to work with an agency like yours?
Yeah. Well, I could give you the whole to me, there's been a real evolution over the last 25 years, and maybe we can get into that. But I think when people don't have much of a background and they spend a lot of time trying to figure out how to create sort of a mask on the outside of who they are, that's where all the problems start to happen, because what people really want is just to see who you are. And even if that's an ugly logo and some makeshift packaging, it's the real you, and you're coming out. I think what's what I love about the CPG space is like you have this honeymoon period where you can just be like, hey, I'm really good at the food stuff, and all these other components are just going to be what they're going to be. And at some point, there's an evening out that happens, but if someone doesn't have much of a background, the worst thing you can do is sort of fabricate some facade.
Right. Well, and I think that's really important. I refer to it affectionately as the sad brown bag phase.
Yeah.
Where you hopefully have a really great or delicious or whatever it is product inside of a really humble package that you probably got from Amazon or Uline or some generic thing. Right. And I think for somebody with a design sensibility like you, again, that's one of those early metrics. It's because I always say that like a really great marketer can get you to buy anything once, right? But if what's inside of that container, so you can make the slickest, coolest, most appealing packaging ever and convince you to buy this one time, but then you try it, if it's really gross or it doesn't do what it says it's going to do, then getting you to buy it a second time is next to impossible. So if I'm going to bet on one thing, like get the inside of the package right.
Correct.
And then have everything else emanate out from there, and you can always refine and iterate. And I feel like that's important for people even to understand that even the biggest brands, it's not like you arrive at, you're like, okay, this is done, this is the end. Like even the biggest brands from Nike to Starbucks to McDonald's or whatever else, like Apple, they evolve over time. There's not like it wasn't perfectly formed early on, and even if it's already successful, it continues to evolve.
Totally agree. Yeah, and it is like there's a genuineness to that evolution. I think that part of this change from I call it the Mad Men era, like 25 years ago, where it was just a different time. But now people, they don't want to like buy a thing; they want to like join something. They want to be a part of who put that whole sad brown bag together, and like what's this amazing thing that's inside. They want to be part of it. They want to tell others about it, and that's a totally different situation than just throwing money at marketing or having everything look polished and perfect.
Yeah, it's almost like, you use the word mask. It's almost like it's not even just makeup. It's sort of like you're saying that people, what they want is for you to take the makeup off, show them the real you, which I think you actually see with on Instagram and TikTok and all these other platforms now is, you'll get these like influencer beauty models, and part of it is like even like this is the real me, or even a famous celebrity, like I'm showing you the real me and you have access into the real me, and that's a really powerful connection.
Yeah, I totally agree, and I actually think like people are looking for imperfection, even beyond like sort of a sloppiness. They're actually looking for the iterative process, and like to say, well, that flavor was terrible. I made pad thai pizza once, and I will never do that again.
Big regret, yeah.
Yeah, Chef Special was a failure. But to show that and like be kind of like open about that, that's actually what draws people in as much as like way more than trying to have everything like all your ducks in a row.
Absolutely. Yeah. So like tell us a little bit. So the name of your firm is Drawn, and I know that's not an accident. You're a really thoughtful guy. How did you come up with that name?
Yeah. So it ties into this whole historical kind of like perspective. I think that the idea is like we try to create these experiences that people are naturally drawn to. So I started it 21 years ago now, and at that time, you could kind of say whatever you wanted to say, and people would kind of believe whatever you had to say. Mm-hmm. And I really felt like that was sort of a disingenuous way to go about brand building or advertising or whatever. So I tried to do things a little bit differently. Instead of like chasing for attention, the jazz hands out there like, hey, look at me. We instead tried to create something that people were drawn to. And the idea being, it takes a little longer. It takes probably a little more investment. It's a slower process. But once people come aboard and like are drawn into this thing and they're like curious about it and wanting to engage with it, suddenly they're lifelong fans. And then they start telling all their friends and their family. And instead of just throwing thousands, millions of dollars at advertising, if you create this this thing that people want to be a part of, and they're drawn into it, and then they start being your advertisers for you. It's just a totally different dynamic. Today, it feels much more commonplace. 25, 21 years ago, it was just a really hard road to start out. But that's where the name comes from. And so the idea of creating experiences is a little vague. But essentially, instead of like, we're not creating packaging that people are drawn to, it's actually like all of these components. They all kind of form this like collective experience I have with a brand. And the more that we can create these collective experiences, all these like micro experiences that add up to something and people are drawn into them, there's something really magical about that. And it's more challenging, but it's way more rewarding, I think.
It is, absolutely, because what it does is I think it presents your fans or your super fans with a gift, right? And something that they can share, because we have this human impulse we want to share, right? Which actually is quite useful from a marketing perspective.
Yeah.
But we want to share things that make us proud or look good, or whatever it is, whatever our identity needs are. If your kid did an amazing thing, there's just this thing where you want to share, maybe not with the world, but at least with like your loved ones, like, hey, look, my kid did this amazing thing. You don't want to just keep it to yourself. But part of that is, if you think about that same impulse when it comes to a brand or a product, when people discover a new thing that they love that solves their problem, they want to share it. So have you packaged it, not just physically, but even emotionally and in every other way, in a way that makes it really shareable? And I know that like early on, in my journey with Siete Family Foods, I kind of saw in that family story, it was a story of overcoming, right? So a family gathers together in support of their sister and daughter to overcome a major health challenge. And, third generation Mexican American family that does all this together, and they change their diet, they change their lifestyle, and everybody's in it. And like, it was a thing where I thought, like, this is a story that nobody could be against, right? Like and so if you can tell that story in a way that's authentic and it resonates with the audience, then that kind of that serves up some things, I think, that can be really powerful for a brand.
Yeah. And the whole storytelling thing, I think, is a really difficult piece of vocabulary, because
right.
You can tell the story, but you actually like want somehow people to join the story. Like, they're not part of the family, but in a way they kind of feel part of the family, right? Yeah. That's where the real magic, I think, happens in the sharing. Is it's not just me telling you about this other thing, but like, I'm now kind of a part of this other thing. I'm a cousin now.
That's right. I don't just listen to Justin Bieber. I'm a belieber, right? I'm in the group, right? I self-identify.
Yeah.
Yeah, I go on the record now.
Yeah. And I think that's just a different, like, so storytelling is sort of a way to give people these pieces that they can then like fill in themselves in a lot of way. If it's just like, it's on the back of the package, here's our family story, there's nothing I can participate in. But somehow finding those little crevices that people can somehow identify. Like, I know Siete's got people have significant food allergies, and somehow now they can identify with that part of the story, and it becomes part of their own story, and they share that with others.
Yeah, I think that part is super powerful. So, like, one of the things that I feel like I learned from you early on, and you and I've, like I said, known each other for a long time, is that you have a very clear process. And I think that's an important thing that I've taken away and kind of developed my own version of a process. Like, if a brand comes to you in whatever early inchoate stage of its development, like, do you have like, what's your process? Like, as a design leader and thinker, like, how do you, like, hey Bryan, help me out. Like, where do I even start? Like, what does that process look like?
Well, it's a very defined process, and it has no definition at all. It's like
paradox.
I've engaged with a number of other agencies who have very like rote process in terms of like we do this the same way every time, and ours has a lot of wiggle room for really understanding the unique situation that each person's in. But there is like a consistency to it, and that's to begin by understanding like who you are on this DNA level. As you're starting out, you're kind of too young in a lot of ways to truly even understand what your own DNA looks like. And so like sometimes you just got to get out there and start doing the farmers markets and the early stage sad brown bag kind of
exactly
stage.
Yeah.
But there comes a point where you start to have all of these pieces, and the first thing that we try to do is understand as many of those pieces as we can. So
when you think about those pieces, what are you trying to uncover?
A little bit about that story, but it's like, what are those things that are the values that are most, intimate to whoever this group is? A lot of people write mission statements or value propositions, I throw all those away. I don't find them to be too unique. But there's this brand personality we try to write. So it's like taking all of these pieces and understanding what truly makes you, you. And then we articulate it in this it's got to be on one page, and it's different every time.
Which requires a certain discipline, right?
Yeah.
It can't be 20 pages. You can't keep sprawling down the road. Yeah.
Right. So it fits on a page. It's long enough to elaborate a little bit, but it's tight enough that everyone can read hopefully a page.
Yeah.
And the idea is to like spend enough time understanding all of those things that make you you and putting them on this page that sometimes is written in story form, sometimes it's bullet form. It's always different, but the idea is like if we're understanding who you are at this like deep core level and we can articulate it on the sheet and we all agree like this is who we are, then that becomes sort of your North Star for how you're going to like do everything. So sure, the logo, the package, the name,
the website,
the headquarters,
right.
I mean, how you engage, how you answer the phone, the clothes that you wear, like everything has to kind of match that in order to kind of keep this authenticity, this alignment that's happening. So then instead of me coming in and saying, hey, everybody, I'm the expert here, and you need to listen to me, I can say, we all agreed this sheet says this is who we are. And we all said, let's say we're an orange company, and we've got a bunch of stuff that's not orange, then like, let's figure out what we're going to do here.
Yeah, either we weren't in fact orange.
Correct, yeah.
Or we should probably get rid of the not orange stuff.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And then it removes the egos, it removes the like personality kind of like conflicts or like, but I like orange. That's great. You may love orange, but
that's right.
We all decided that we're not an orange company. So
which is different than, say, like decorating your house, right? So you can decorate. The way that I talk about this to people is like, look, if you want to paint the walls of your house pink, purple, like white, black, it doesn't matter. And you don't even have to have a reason. The strongest brands, you have a reason, right? So this is a very thoughtful, intentional process. It's not just, and again, there might even be a reason behind the reason. I'll give you an example. I knew where I grew up, there was this relatively well-known resort, and they had been successful, and they had these pretty ugly pink cabins, and that people, they would bring in various designers or whatever else, and they would give them suggestions, and almost every time the very first thing they would suggest is, well, you should really get rid of these ugly pink cabins, and the owner would dismiss them almost out of hand. And the reason for that is it was super nostalgic, because that pink color was, when they got started, he mixed all the leftover paint that he had, nice. And that was the only that was the color of the that he had. He had like 6 buckets of paint or something, and that's the only color he could afford to paint the building. Yeah. And so it became his color of pink. And so that actually, it seemed kind of random, but there was a logic and a reasoning behind it.
Yeah, and that's like that. Sounds like it almost like became part of the DNA is right. The pink cabins. Like that doesn't make sense, but everyone identified that place up there with the pink cabins. And so then if it becomes that it's fully embraced at that point and it goes on this like sheet, then it doesn't matter what the architects think is aesthetically beautiful.
That's right.
It has to do with does it match our DNA or not?
That's right. Yeah. So now you've told me before, and I know like in your training, one of the things that I think that you bring to the process is you have a rule of thumb that you learned from one of your design professors in school.
Yeah.
Tell us what that rule of thumb is, and how does it play out for you in the design process?
Yeah, there were actually two rules.
Okay.
Alva was my professor. So first rule is always start with the pencil. And the reason for that is that was at a time, believe it or not, where computers were just coming out.
Yeah.
And it was very easy to jump on and start like hitting filters and buttons and making things look cool.
I can put a gradient on anything.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, but there was no like intentionality behind it. I wasn't trying to accomplish that sheet, that brand personality. I was just hitting things and going, that looks cool.
Yeah, it's a cool effect.
When you have a pencil and a piece of paper, you're like, I mean, you can't hit any filter buttons. And so suddenly you're much more disciplined in trying to accomplish that thing that you're heading out to accomplish. The second rule is to, it was essentially to like basically be inspired, look at other ideas, but don't cheat. So the idea of like original thought is really, really almost impossible in a lot of ways. That everything's been thought of.
Right.
But there are these unique little ways of, accomplishing anything or presenting anything. So I think it was really valuable to encourage us to look and observe and watch. And I have a hard time driving because I'm like constantly like surveying everything around me.
Right.
But you take all of that and then like the idea of don't cheat, because you can just, steal someone else's idea and then it's not your own. You weren't accomplishing that sheet, but let it inspire you and influence you and like produce something truly unique.
Right, but it's not necessarily cheating if you see something in one domain and you see how it's applied. Let's say, you're somewhere in another country and you see something applied to a different industry or something like that, and you say, "Oh, I think that's a really interesting way that they paired these two things together."
Yep.
And then you bring that back to the States and you think, "Oh, I wonder how you could pair those two materials together in a different way here in a different adaptation of that."
Exactly. And that's that inspiration, but then you're kind of making it your own at the same time.
Yeah. I think that I love, so I think two things that you've talked about already that are pretty interesting to me are this notion of like that you force the discipline of having that brand personality on a single page, which is harder than it sounds because, and not for the reason, again, I think a lot of people assume that it is harder to write a 20-page something than a 1-page something. But in fact, once you start doing this stuff a lot, the opposite is true. And I actually had a professor in graduate school who was adamant that we had to write a single-page paper every single week of the class, and he would just rip you to shreds. So it was really about the discipline, and that there's no extraneous or superfluous word or anything like that crept into what you were talking about. And the same thing I think is true, that you've created these parameters or boundaries that force a set of discipline upon you and your team and your collaborators. And then you've also done the same thing with start with a pencil, where you've taken out a lot of the other kind of options or tools or all that kind of stuff, and it's like, no, what can you create? What you're at that point, you've even a pencil is only the color of graphite. It's not color. It's not, and again, this is a thing that I feel like I learned from you early on related to process, because if I give you two designs and one of them I present to you in blue and one I present to you in red, but they're different designs, you might pick the red one just because you like red more, right? And
exactly.
and you're not actually paying attention to what happens. So typically a lot of times you'll see these designs. I know in the process that you use, you're trying to do things more in black and white and grayscale, and then you're folding in color, which is obviously hugely important, but it's a separate discussion.
Yeah. Maybe I can give a quick example. Because,
yeah, that's great.
We helped start a brewery probably 5 years ago. 5 years ago, and they came, and it was two brothers. It was their last name, and they clearly had not gone to the U.S. trademark website, and quickly we found it was trademarked. So we started with nothing. We didn't have a name. We didn't have anything. We went through the exercise. We wrote the one page, and they kept doing this like literally with their hands, kind of making these intersections of like, we want to be about art and science and about Germanic and about Northwest, and about creativity, but also kind of this like discipline and refinement. And so they kept making these like intersections, and you could tell like there was something about this like intersection between the two that really was meaningful to them, and kind of like, we don't want to be old and sterile, but we don't want to be just, throw bubble gum in our beer and call it,
right.
Cool. So we went through that whole process. We got them to kind of like literally sign the sheet, the brand personality. And out of that, we came up with the name Cold Fire. Cold Fire is like this juxtaposition of two things. It also came from a book by Michael Pollan where it was about nature's fermentation process is like a cold fire. So they wanted to go all the way back to the roots of like where brewing started. And so here we are going all the way back to how nature has like cooked things through fermentation.
Yeah.
So the name has this juxtaposition and this like tied to this old like origin. And then we build this brand with all of these angles. So everything is either a 30, 45, or 50 degree angle. In like hand lettered the font for the name and the icon. And then like when you walk into the actual tasting room, like the walls all have these same angles on them. No one can really pick all of these things out. No one would sit there and go like, I see you're at the intersection of art and science here.
That's right. That's right. Yeah, it's not a literal or even conscious thing.
No.
Yeah.
But all of these things are supporting that same brand personality that we started with. The labels are very simple. They're just sort of stated.
Right.
More like a wine label maybe than like, grab your attention type label.
So and then in that brand, it seems like there's a strong copper element to that. How did you arrive at copper for that?
Yeah. So our color palette was actually all natural pigments. So there was nothing or metals or rock. So there was nothing like artificial about the color palette. So that makes it sort of unstated on the shelf. But it's like natural pigments, and then this copper color just seemed back to that old earthy kind of like raw material. And you could go with a number of things. Gold sort of has its own connotations, and as does silver, and there was something about copper that sort of fit who they are.
Yeah.
So.
No, that's really good. Yeah, and I've seen the angles like where you had done some of those early sketches, and some of in the symbol, the angles show up in both the symbol and how they carry through to that hand lettered typographic element of the logo as well.
Yeah, and the icon came from two symbols, like the Germanic shield is sort of, or European shields, but that seems sort of old fashioned in a lot of ways. And so we found this, Germanic Celtic sort of symbol for eternity, and we were kind of like, that's where you were like borrowing ideas, right? And then kind of making them your own out of that process.
Yeah, that's super interesting. Yeah, so that's a great example of how like that early process of discovery and that sort of thing. And then you even touched on how it wasn't just here's a name, here's a logo, or here's a symbol. Good luck. Yeah. It's how does that name, how do those angles, how does the color palette play out in this case in a tap room, at the retail shelf? Who are you, and how is that instantiated in all these different environments where you're doing business?
Yeah, and I don't think I don't think most people see all of those implications and how, like, so I did learn that the only person that can name a beer is the brewer. So as much as I wanted to influence that was something I wasn't able to have an influence on.
Yeah.
And they're all random. You know,
Right.
they're not there's no tie to them, and that really bothers me because it's that one thing that doesn't fit the sheet.
Right.
When you have a honky tonk lager, you know, it's like it doesn't really fit into what we were going for.
That's right.
But you know, like I see all of those connections. I think when we are working with brands, we're trying to find, I mean, the tiniest like thing that seems out of alignment, because it sends mixed messages to people.
Mm-hmm.
Like it says, well, we kind of care about these things, but not really,
Mm-hmm.
you know? And when you start having those, people start to pull back a little bit, and they start to like withdraw a little, and they don't even really realize it, because if everything's in alignment, everything kind of like matches, you're just kind of trusting that if the 7 interactions I've had have all been consistent, number 8's going to be the same, and number 9 and number 10, and then I become more invested and drawn into it, and I can trust it.
Yeah. I think that's really powerful. I refer to it as the restaurant bathroom test, right? So like if the bathroom at the restaurant is clean and sanitized, then one might infer that the kitchen is also clean and sanitized, which might lead you to the conclusion that the food is cleaner and safer and that sort of thing too, right? So it's not necessarily that you're making these conscious decisions or even associations, but there's this implicit trust that is built between, you know, in this case, the consumer, but any user or of a product or service. You know, the more consistent, and it's not that everything has to be super matchy if that's not the brand, but you're delivering consistently whatever, you know, and I think you mentioned that with the way you answer the phones and all of those. And you think about the totality of your business, how does it line up? If you're, you know, if your whole brand vibe is like beachy, chill, you know, like the turtle from Finding Nemo or something like that, and then somebody answers the phone at your front desk, and they start like, you know, they're like country and they're cussing you out or something like that. It just it's not that one is good or bad. It just doesn't make sense. No. It doesn't fit.
Yeah, we designed a restaurant, or we've designed several, but the first one we did, we actually sat and like walked through the process at other places, from literally getting your car at your house or your job, let's say, and you're going to go to this place, and thinking of all of the little micro experiences you have before you ever get to the point of ordering food. So the parking lot, what's that like? What's it like walking across the street? What's it like opening the door, and like that first impression, and the temperature and the smells and the way you're greeted, and then like all of those little like micro interactions are really informing my decisions. And if all of them feel like they've been thought about, then like by the time I get my food,
it's tremendous.
It's totally different than if it's like, I mean, you could have a really sketchy and like schizophrenic sort of experience, and the food might be amazing, but you're sort of on guard at that point.
That's right. Unless that was intentional, unless it's sort of like part of the vibe is like you want to serve people through bulletproof glass or something like that. Like, okay, this is the vibe that I'm going for here. But I think it's that level of deliberate, thoughtful practice that for me as a person who cares a lot about marketing and branding, that's the stuff that I see in some brands. I see it's pretty unusual, or it's pretty rare, and when it's done really well, I just want to tip my cap to people, because I tend to refer to it as I refer to them as 1,000 micro impressions that aggregate up into a broader experience, and it's multisensory, right? So you can think about a restaurant. If I walk into a restaurant, let's say it's a steakhouse or something like that, and it smells like sewage in the front door. Like, so imagine if everything else about the restaurant is perfect. The steak is perfect, the rest of the ambiance is perfect, but it smells like sewage. That's not a great experience, right? And so you can have one aspect of your sensory experience that throws everything else off. If you had everything else about this steakhouse is great, but you couldn't find a parking space, closer than a mile away or something like that, and it's raining, and all of these, like, there's just a thoughtfulness, I feel like, that goes into the way that some brands have, kind of engage with their consumers. And it's particularly challenging, and this gets us back to the consumer packaged goods space. I think if you have a restaurant or a pub even, you can control not everything, but most even of the elements of that experience. If you're a consumer good and you're on the shelf somewhere else at somebody else's store, you have really a low degree of impact in how that broader experience plays out. Now, as somebody who's designing, in addition to these other things, you're designing on behalf of consumer brands, how does that inform what you're thinking about when it comes to packaging and merchandising and presentation and utilizing it at home or whatever?
Yeah, that is a challenge. So obviously, like the actual package itself has a whole like process that's maybe longer and a lot more debate over like what should be on the package and how it should look and feel.
Right.
But then there are so many things that are out of your control, and I only know part of the whole game, the positioning and all of that part of the CPG space. I don't really know how to comment on, but we've done a lot of things with, like, you think of the shelf stocker and like probably a sucky job some of the time,
Sure.
And so like doing little things on the carton itself before it ever gets to the shelf and just like thanking them for, their efforts, like,
yeah,
that might be just that little extra incentive. And if that's like true to who you are, and like you let those little compliments happen behind closed doors in a lot of different ways, I think that those all add up to be the sort of like helpers along the way to get that full experience. I mean, social media is what it is, and like it's always going to be that like loud voice out there. But if you get a chance to do in-store tasting, a lot of those are just like kind of boring and like
black tablecloth, generic person, uninformed, no mood, anything.
So like turn that on its head and rethink it. And what if we could do fewer but like way more meaningful? Like that whole experience could be really dynamic and the thing that sets you apart in some ways. Or like summer tours where you're like scooting around the country, or like there's just different ways in which you can like influence those experiences that may feel like you have very limited influence on.
Yeah, no, that's really good. Like what have you learned in working with a number of different founders when it comes to, I think that it's easy to dismiss the packaging part of this, but it is, CPG, like the middle word is packaged, right? So it's and that's the primary package, that's the secondary package that you just mentioned, where other people may be seeing it who aren't ultimately the consumer. Is there a framework that you've kind of developed or that you use as a guide for how you determine whether a package is successful or unsuccessful?
Yeah, that's a good question, because there's so many influences on like what causes someone to pick it up. And so you can get a little distracted by just looking at a limited set of data. But I like how, I mean, you're actually the one who taught me about this whole, like, it's got to earn its way on the front cover kind of an idea. And I really think that intuitively, I've agreed with that for a long time. Like, I just had a meeting a couple of weeks ago. We're working on a like climate campaign. They want to tell like 20 pages of a story on the side of a bus, and we're like, it's just not going to work.
There's actually an inverse relationship. It's like it's the billboard rule, right?
Yeah.
The more words, the less likely it is to be read.
Yeah.
You have one word, people are going to read it.
Yeah.
Up to 3 words, people will read it. Every subsequent additional word, less likely they read it.
Yeah. Exactly. Totally agree. And so the idea of like less is more, I think, is a really good principle. I also think that there's something about thinking of your packaging as like it's sacred, it can never be touched or changed. that is a really bad idea in this space, because we work in a lot of different industries. No other space moves at the insane pace that CPG does. And so if your package hasn't changed in 10 years, which we worked with a company and they literally hadn't changed it in 10 years, well, I think that informs what people think of you. Like,
you're stagnant.
You're stagnant. You're just fine being what you are. You're not aware that other things are going on, and tastes are changing and preferences are changing and competition is arising. And so that idea of like never ever changing because we're not supposed to change or because it's too expensive, like that's probably a bad road to be stuck on.
It kind of gives this perhaps unconscious impression that everything else about your business is sort of on autopilot. There's no news, there's no innovation. It's like, okay.
Maybe new flavor, whatever.
Yeah, that's all. And it's like, okay, there's your ketchup. You want more ketchup? Here's more ketchup, right?
Conversely, if you're like wildly changing things all the time, like people are like, what's going on?
There's
like,
whiplash there too.
Yeah, exactly. So there's definitely like a middle ground there. But I do think change is good. Being disciplined on how much goes on the front is good. And then there's all kinds of theories, from, the color blocking to the large logo to the whatever. That's probably, we spend a lot of time walking shelves, and if the space you're moving into is, got an opportunity that seems unique, I think that's probably the best direction to go.
Right. Yeah, within the parameters, right? You can't have, like if everything else on the shelf is about 6 inches and you're like, I have an idea. We're gonna have an 18-inch tall package. You're like, they're not gonna move the whole shelf for you because, I mean, if you were Starbucks, maybe they would, but they're not doing it for you if you're a startup.
Yeah, we just did this with a brand on the ethnic food aisle, and kind of, like, they're just different. Like, the logos are different, the choices on the packaging and the colors and how things are all presented. It just was a little bit different than some of the other aisles we've been working on. And so it was good to spend time in a bunch of places walking those aisles to just kind of, so obviously not the 18-inch, bottle. But at the same time, you can stand out in different ways on different aisles, I think. Yeah,
absolutely. You can use color, shape. There's a lot of other, tools at your disposal as well. So, like when you're talking with, let's say I'm a really early stage brand, and I come to you, and it's maybe not just you, but in general a design agency or a broader marketing agency. When is it too early, or when is it not right yet, for whatever reason, for someone to work with an agency versus kind of going it on their own?
It's a good question. A lot of it I think has, so you do have this, we call it the honeymoon period, the sad, I can't say that.
The sad brown bag. Yeah. Uh-huh.
Yeah. I mean, you do have a little bit of this grace period where you can really focus on product, on distribution, on some of those early hurdles that you got to get over. I don't think it makes sense to have an agency doing your stuff. I don't even know if it makes sense to have anyone in-house to be doing stuff. You can find a couple of freelancers. You can go to Kinko's and get some help, right? Like,
right.
You got to be scrappy and focus on the product and focus on those distribution relationships.
And what's interesting is, I see this a lot, people who either have some resources, some money, or they think, oh, I've got to do this. They'll actually over-design too early, which is not, on the surface, feels like it's not, it shouldn't be a bad thing. And I don't know that it's 100% a bad thing, but what I've observed is, if your packaging looks too put together too early on, then you don't have this, people want to help the little guy. They want to help the underdog. And if you look like you're not the little guy, if you look like you're, a gazillionaire, or you're some new brand spun off by some giant company, then it strangely impacts their availability or interest in promoting you, which is really kind of a weird dynamic. You're like, oh, you've got this. You clearly, it looks like you spent hundreds of thousands of dollars on all this kind of stuff, so you don't need me to, promote your product for free or tell my friends about it?
Yeah, I think it really has to match the velocity. If you're thinking like going up a hill and you need people to help push from behind, like to get up over that hill, then yeah, you got to kind of your visual presentation has to kind of match that uphillness that you're going. I mean, you could be a massive company and start a new brand and sure, like come out of the gate, but it's going to match like you have national placement on day one. Like then, yeah, maybe you can do it.
Right.
But I agree that it takes some time. And so in terms of like when it's time to bring on an agency, like I think of it as it's always bumpy. Like that start, you're so used to being scrappy and like saving every penny for things that matter. And then all of a sudden, like you're working with people who feel like they're robbing you. I mean, it's really difficult. And I would say probably half of our CPG relationships don't work out after a couple months.
Right.
As much as we try to like make sure we're all on the same page, it's a rough transition from spending nothing, to what it costs to really get in and get to know this DNA level.
It's a big investment.
Right.
Yeah.
So be ready for like bumps.
Right.
And then like I think of it in terms of if you're starting to staff up on the design side and design in the big general sense, like if you're starting to staff up, that's when I would say like you might really consider hiring an agency.
Right.
There's a lot of actual like hidden costs with staffing up internally that you don't think about, and you're still trying to be nimble. You're still trying to like create this bandwidth without the overhead.
Right.
And that's when I think
you got to expand your office. There's benefits and all the things associated with
the
that.
Software and the hardware. And then what happens is inevitably those people are very transient. So after a year or 2 years, they leave.
Right. Artists.
New person. Careful. The new person comes in and they don't have this vision, and suddenly your stuff's changing, and like you have this inconsistency just because of that.
Right.
For all of those reasons, I think an agency can be good, but it's usually a bumpy start.
Right. Well, and I think that you pointed out too, a common pitfall is that people probably assume I'm going to hire an agency or a designer and they're going to paint me a pretty picture, right? And so then you say, no, that's not what we do. We're going to actually, we're going to do DNA testing on you, right? And it's like, well, I didn't ask, I need pretty pictures. Yeah. I don't need DNA testing. You're like, no, the pretty picture for you is very different than the pretty picture for someone else. And if you want to do this right, you've got to, it's an investment of time and money. And again, for a lot of people who aren't as familiar with that process, that feels like no, I'm in a hurry. I've got a deadline to meet, that sort of thing. And so that would make sense that there might often be challenges around alignment on that side.
Yeah, I mean, we used to be more dogmatic about like, hey, we can't do anything until we do this brand personality, until we get our North Star figured out. And then we realized like this is really difficult for people they didn't come to us asking for this. They want the pretty picture. And so I think we have like found a decent rhythm of like, let's start making some pretty pictures. And do this at the same time, right?
Which gives them confidence that, in fact, you can make the pretty pictures.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, and you know what? If they're kind of in this rapid prototyping stage of product development, let's kind of treat this brand development in the same way. Our pretty picture may have to change in a little while, but at least we can kind of start giving deliverables to meet this like fast pace, and all the while kind of be pulling these little nuggets out that make their way onto this brand personality, and eventually maybe a more formal process of like, hey, can we pause for a little bit and evaluate some of these pretty pictures?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that, I think that's really good advice, and I think it's also that you don't need to rush into this when you're super early. And I think that there are a couple of the bigger consumer facing brands here in Austin are actually really great examples of this. Both Tito's Vodka and Yeti, effectively their logos are like Microsoft Word system fonts, right? So, and they've done okay. And obviously over time, both of those brands have evolved in a lot of different ways and have a significant amount of sophistication about how they're executed. But it's not that it had to, their success or failure was not determined by having the coolest, hippest thing at the very early stage, right?
I can't look at the Tito's logo, but
it's painful. Yeah.
But yes, so I think, the Mad Men era, as I call it, like before things became more digital in nature, like that actually was way more important. That brand mark, that like iconic package. But nowadays it seems like logos are fluid. Like I remember early on telling people this is going to last 20 years. And now like there's a fluidity to the brand mark even that never used to be there.
Yeah.
And so I think people are wanting much more of this like multi-sensorial kind of like fluid experience more than like that red Coca-Cola script,
right. I tend to think of them like this is a little bit antiquated, but I tend to think of them like album covers a bit, and it's like certain bands, the Rolling Stones or whatever, have a logo, but then there a lot of other bands that them by their album covers, or at least you used to, and so I think that every 3 to 5 years you're at least revisiting, maybe tweaking. You're not wholesale changing things, but you're imagining a different. Because you're evolving as a person, you're evolving as a company and as a brand. If you've continued to grow, you may have new or different products along the way, and that you may have cast a wider net, or maybe even the opposite. You've been even more focused.
Yeah, I totally agree. I still think there's something sacred about the brand mark, that icon.
Yeah.
But there is like way more forgiveness than there ever has, in like how the whole aesthetic kind of like is this amoeba that keeps like moving along with the brand.
Right. Yeah, that's really good. So what are the are there bits of advice that you find that you give to startups that you're talking to, particularly in the CPG space, regularly when it comes to defining their brand and some of these early stage directional parts of growing your business?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think I hate the word authenticity now because like everyone...
It's just overused, yeah.
But there is something about like being really, really like transparent and just this is who we are. I think focusing on an amazing product, like we like to work with a number of different industries and companies. And the one thing we're looking for is just a good thing, a good product or a service or something, because it's really hard to make something attractive that's just like subpar.
Yeah.
So focusing on the product, being sort of like open and vulnerable in a lot of ways, and then, like the whole principle of design thinking and like empathy, like go hang out with your customers and go be on the floor with the shelf stockers and just spend time with the people who are actually buying the product and serving you, and go ride a truck and like,
really understand it.
Yeah. It will totally change how you do everything. Yeah. So
that's really good. So let's dig into that just a little bit more. And I know this is if you're a designer, you're familiar with the term design thinking. If you're not a designer, you may be less familiar with it, and you may think it doesn't apply to you. But in fact, the opposite is true. So help people who maybe aren't in that world understand what you mean by design thinking. And you mentioned that one aspect of that is empathy.
Yeah. So, I mean, design thinking is like a vocabulary word for common sense to me.
Right. Yeah.
It's a way for people to put some sort of structure around what I find to be fairly common sense. And it's actually, I think, fairly intuitive to most startups, but especially in the food space. So the principles are basically empathy, which is also a word that's overused, but like understanding what the people who are dealing with, basically people, walking in their shoes, understanding their lives and what their day's like. Rapid prototyping, the idea that you're not going to like come out of the gate with everything polished and perfect, but you're going to make really ugly little starts, get some feedback, and keep making it prettier and prettier until it's something that you have you can push at scale.
Right, you're sketching, and so like if you've ever sketched, the first move of the pencil is not beautiful. It's not finished, and it's like the line's probably off. Like if you think about like you're really sketching and you're going back and forth, give it a minute. It'll eventually take shape. But if you're like, oh, the first mark, you're like, oh, I don't know if I like this. Like, well, that's not how sketching works.
Right, exactly. So yeah, empathy, rapid prototyping, and then I kind of forget after that, but it's this evolving process of like putting stuff out there, refining it, watching people engage with it, go back and iterate again, and you're continually like evolving as you go.
Right. And you're collaborating with people along the way too. You're not necessarily just doing that in isolation. Design thinking, totally. I feel like if you didn't know what that meant, you might assume, oh, I need to get like some studio or a cave or something and just go, I need to think hard about design. And in fact, that's not the case. It's about taking all these inputs, having, to your point, kind of this rapid prototyping, iterative process, but that iterative thing requires constructive critical feedback, right? Where you're like, hey, I made a thing, what do you think?
Yeah.
And you have to be okay with the fact that people are like, I don't like it.
Yeah.
And it can't hurt, which is hard because that could have been your baby. You like made a thing, and you're like, look, mom and dad, I made this thing, and you're like, son, your drawing's terrible, or whatever. Right. And hopefully you've created a culture where people can do that in a way that doesn't like destroy your feelings, but you're also like, as somebody who's thinking about the design, you're not overly invested emotionally, because that can be dangerous too. Yeah. But I think it's also really important for the people, like nobody in your organization gets a pass from design thinking. And I think that's a really important thing for people to understand, that like you want the accounting department involved in the design thinking process.
Totally agree. Yeah, so maybe I can give a story of like, I mean, it's not a CPG brand, but that restaurant that we designed, it was meant to be this whole like pre-prohibition kind of era, old, nostalgic, and I could go through every decision inside the actual physical space and why we chose everything that we did, but
why the tabletops were that material and everything about it.
We salvaged wood from the original Pabst Blue Ribbon factory and used it for all the furniture. Like every detail was thought through. But the menu was the most difficult. So they had 81 taps. You got to have something digital because they just
it's going to rotate,
too quickly. TVs it didn't work. It didn't fit. So we ended up building a database. We projected it onto this old wood wall, and no one knew it was this projected menu, but it was a digital interface. Mm-hmm. So then we stop and we launch, and people are coming in, and then we're watching. So we're kind of back, repeating the cycle now. We're sitting with people, we're watching as people walk in, they see how long the line is, and then they leave. Or we check people sitting at a table, they might want another round, but they look up at the line, it's too long, they leave. We had people leaving credit cards constantly because you have to like start a tab. So we take that database and we start solving these problems. Like we start making little fixes.
And normally you would think, oh, my designer doesn't need to solve these problems. That's a, whatever, that's an operations issue
IT
or something. Yeah, an IT issue or whatever.
Yeah, so when you're thinking of this more holistically and more of like a whole experience that you're trying to create, well, a long line's kind of problematic. Yeah. We also knew from the back end, like, by the time we started solving these problems, we created a little app for reordering from your table. We built it off of the same projected menu database, and we put it on a phone on the website, and you could reorder from your table. We also saw, like, in the back end, as we were solving all these patron problems, we were creating like management problems. So now all of a sudden the bar manager's entering every inventory item 5 times. It was like such a pain. And so now we're like, well, let's solve those problems. And so over 5 years, we went from designing this tiny little restaurant into now we're launching this digital app that restaurants all over the country can use to compete with these national companies who have billions of dollars to spend on IT. And that was like using this design thinking process to go from a tiny little restaurant into this new app that's being, purchased and subscribed to by all these restaurants and hotels and theaters and all kinds of places around the country.
So really fundamentally what you're describing is it's a problem-solving methodology, right?
Yeah.
And it has obviously an aesthetic component to it, but it's not exclusively about the colors and shapes and textures.
Yes, and that's like a hard mind shift for people to think about. But if you're really going for a whole experience where all the little micro experiences are all kind of saying the same thing, and then you really have to kind of break down the traditional silos of, well, IT handles that, and our architect handles that, and our web developer handles that, and
our interior designer handles that, which is different than the architect, or that sort of thing. Yeah.
And when you have all those different people and they're not all in alignment, then you're going to end up with this sort of a bunch of parts, not a whole experience.
That's right. Yeah, it's sort of the Johnny Cash one piece at a time song, where it's got the car made out of every era of General Motors. So is there when a business grows and they start working with you or another agency, what's the best way for a brand to work with an agency? Is that what does that look like when that relationship is successful both ways?
Yeah.
What are the hallmarks of a successful brand plus design or marketing agency relationship?
Yeah. Probably humility and trust seem like the two words that first came to mind when you said that. When you come in and you've got very specific, measurable goals, right out of the gate that this relationship is going to achieve, that just doesn't seem like a very reasonable way to walk into a new relationship. But
right. It's just like you're dating somebody or something like that, and you're like, okay, so I'm looking for the following things out of this relationship, and you're just sitting down over dinner. You're like, you might be a little bit, this is not how this relationship's going to go. Yeah.
Yeah, and if there's not humility and trust in both directions, it's probably going to be a short-term relationship. So the agency needs to have humility and realize you're the expert, your product, you are the one who stayed up all night, making the product and selling it the next day and then going to your day job. You've earned your stripes, and I need to learn from you and take your lead in that way. Conversely, there's some things we think we can help you with, and they're going to take some time, and you're not going to recognize the value at first. And you need to trust and be willing to kind of go down that road. And if you're not at a place where you can afford the time and the emotional patience that might take, then it's probably not you're not ready for that yet.
Right.
But when you start to trust each other, and when you have this humility in both directions, and you become essentially an extension of the team as opposed to either side dictating how things go, then you have beautiful relationships and really good things happen.
Yeah, that's really good. And I think that humility can be really challenging because you get bigger, so you're a brand, and you got to the point where, hey, guess what? I can afford an agency, right? So things are going at least pretty well. Either you're selling a lot, or you were able to convince some investors that they should bet on you, or whatever the thing is. You've got some early indications that you're the stuff. Well, you still have to have humility then too. We get it. You're a big deal. So that's fine. But in any relationship, you can be a big deal, and that's great. But here, we're just going to both really listen to each other and try to be responsive to the other's expertise, and recognize that we have complementary expertise on both sides of the table here.
Yeah, I think the challenges to working with an agency, let's say it's been 3 years. You've been, doing the honeymoon thing for 3 years. You're ready for this. You don't have that slow learning process where if you had hired this whole team in-house bit by bit by bit, it's kind of a gradual understanding of how this all works. So it's this fast marriage. Maybe I just have 5 people added to my team that I've never
Right.
had before. And like it takes like time to figure out how this dance kind of works really well. And if you can have the humility and the patience, and like you're in a place where like like you can figure out when you need to be a little more like clear and say I want to go in this direction, and when you need to like watch how things go and like take the other person's lead. I think those end up being really beautiful in the long run.
Yeah, no, that's really good advice. So you've had this kind of front row seat. You worked with a lot of industries, and you've had a chance to work with a number of consumer packaged goods brands too. What's different in your mind in working with a CPG brand versus the other types of clients or customers? And then, like, because of your proximity to it, like, has it increased? How has your perhaps understanding or expectations around what it might take to grow a CPG brand been altered by being up close and personal with it? Like, do you think, is it like harder or easier, or more accessible? Like, how do you process that now that you've had a chance to work with some different folks?
Yeah, the pace is just remarkably different, and so you can succeed much faster than many other industries, and you can fail much faster than most other industries. There's like this scrappiness that I really like about it. It's there's no real barrier to entry for the most part. Like, you got to have a product, but like anybody can make a product. Yeah. And then it's like
you can't just like open a medical clinic as a doctor. You're like, you had to go to medical school, or you have to check all these boxes. And yeah, there are boxes to check with this, but at least, and that's not saying that being successful is easy by any means.
No.
In some ways it might be harder because there's less, because it's the wild, wild west, that actually succeeding presents its own set of challenges. But at least starting off in the race, you could get trampled.
Yeah, totally agree. And then there's this other element because that's the like foundation, is this like scrappy, competitive, you gotta have sharp elbows and like work hard. This thing becomes your baby. And you get to a point where you have to start like bringing in more people, even in-house, like, and suddenly your team's getting bigger and your vendor list is getting larger, and you have a hard time letting go of that baby. We don't see that as much in any other industry. Like, Dad's plumbing business, is like, I could kind of like move on any day now and be just fine.
That's right. Yeah.
Whereas like CPG, it's held more dearly.
You created a thing, and you're so protective of that thing.
Yeah. And sometimes that really inhibits growth in the long run. Like, you almost squash it because you love it so much.
How does that it's like the old, like, I'm going to love it and squeeze it and call it George and that sort of thing. How does that play out? Like, how could a founder accidentally kill the baby, as it were,
Well, okay, so from our perspective, like, when we get brought in, like, we see that in a number of ways. We had a CPG brand over the summer. We worked with them for about 3 months. It clearly was not working out. They wanted a trifold brochure. I hate trifold brochures, but they really wanted one for a number of different purposes. 28 rounds of revisions. We weren't.
Ouch.
Well, that's not helpful for anyone. Like, it's a waste of their time and money.
For a trifold brochure that's not going to make or break your business.
Absolutely not. It completely lost context. But this thing was so important to the founder that it had to like be manifest into this trifold brochure with the same amount of like care and attention, to the point where we just were like squashing the whole thing. Clearly we didn't have enough deliverables for like the amount of money they're investing, because all we were doing was
re-engineering a trifold brochure, and you weren't necessarily like, hey, I was thinking that the left side should open over the right side, or the right side over the left side. It was probably more about just colors and content.
And then like you're rethinking, like, well, maybe that wasn't the right call, and so we should instead emphasize this thing instead of that thing, and like Yeah, it just you're overthinking it, right? And that's because it's too precious.
Yeah.
And I think that, like looking at the sort of stagnation at that particular brand, I don't think that they're in a very good position for long-term surviving.
Yeah, that's an indicator of a broader set of challenges.
Yeah.
Not that you can't change course and overcome it and that sort of thing, but if you're having that hard of a time with one single project, not a good because there's a lot harder decisions you're going to have to make.
Totally. And but we could see it more from afar, like how that same thing was playing itself out in a number of different places.
Right.
There are a number of indications that it was not going to succeed, but that like strangling because I love it so much is something you don't see in other industries quite like you do in CPG.
That's super interesting. Well, so like just to as we wrap up here, is it possible for somebody who is not, I think sometimes now the truth is when you create a CPG product, you are almost by definition creative, right? Because you created a thing that didn't exist, or at least it didn't exist in that way. But some founders don't think of themselves as a creative. Is there a way for a founder, co-founder, or team that maybe doesn't think of himself, herself, themselves as creative to expand their understanding or kind of approach to creativity in a way that maybe, they're not going to like become a graphic designer, but at least they're more conversant in these things so that they're able to, it would be like somebody, you're working with a specialist on your website and you don't even know what HTML is, or like you have no idea what any of this whole web thing is, but you're just like, well, just do the web thing. You take care of that. Yeah. Like in the same way with design or creativity, is there a way that a founder or that team can prepare themselves better to work or even to expand their own mental capacity to understand and participate in the process?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think a lot of the other agencies I've seen, or like the vendors, the consultants you end up bringing in over time, I find that when someone just hires someone and says, do their thing, do that HTML thing, and there is no curiosity as to like, I don't need to learn HTML, but I'm just curious enough to know how you're going to approach this and why, and make sure that is, for us, it's that like that brand personality, that one page, like there's at least enough curiosity to make sure it's like staying true to the North Star kind of purpose. And if you just start hiring people to do stuff and you don't have that curiosity to understand how it like tethers back to that like North Star, whether it's articulated or it's just in the founder's like soul, that lack of curiosity seems like it can make it difficult to kind of stay true. So, I mean, I don't know how you can prepare necessarily to be a creative, but like just having enough curiosity to say, I'm going to give this 5 minutes of understanding, or to choose people who are willing to kind of like explain the why behind things instead of just say, you need to go in this, this is your trifold.
That's right. Here you go.
But why this is not working well, or why you should consider something else. That curiosity, I think, is really healthy to like understanding the whole creative process.
Right. No, I'll give you an example. Like from my life, like a few careers ago, I was working in the software industry, and I was managing software engineers. And I was not a software engineer, but I realized that as the boss of, in addition to other things I was doing, as the boss of software engineers, that I was really susceptible to getting snowed by people and just like, oh yeah, that's all a back end middleware thing, like, or whatever. And so like, I knew I would never be like a hacker, but like I tried to at least, I would go to conferences and do some pretty deep dives to feel like I understood, at least on a surface level, what's happening in the software world, and what's front end development, and what are people actually doing there, and then what is back end development, what are people actually doing there. And I feel like there's an element of that could be translated over into the world of design and packaging and merchandising and all of these things, where, and you really touched on the curiosity aspects of that too.
Yeah, I have this friend Michael, he's got this like analogy around farming and how, like, if your job, all your job is to water the crops, well, there's actually like an art to watering correctly, and sometimes you have to pull back to let, I don't know, these things, right?
Let the water seep in or
right?
whatever
But
it does.
if all you know is I'm supposed to water things and things are like out there, you're just going to keep watering things, even if you're not understanding how it fits into this whole cycle. And so to at least understand why the weather matters and why we till the way we do, and the seed that we chose to plant, and like when the harvest is going to happen and what has to happen between. Like if you understand at least how that whole cycle works, and your only job's just to water them, you can water correctly. But if you don't understand how it all works, you're just going to keep turning on the sprinklers every day that it's not raining, and maybe that's right and maybe it's not right. And so the more you can at least understand the whole, I think the better your company as a whole will be.
Absolutely. And I think even extending that analogy, in this case, if you're the co-founder of a company, you're the farmer, and maybe you have a team of people who help you farm, and one person, she waters, and one person, he tills, and that sort of thing. And if you just go, I don't know, it's all magic, it's just all farming to me. Yeah. I'm just a farmer, but I don't get into the nitty gritty of like, whether these plants actually need water or something, then it's probably going to limit your ability to be an excellent farmer. Not that ideally you hire somebody who's better at watering than you would be, and somebody who's better at tilling than you would be. But if you have no idea what they're doing, you're probably not a very effective farmer.
Right. There's not a lot of checks and balances when you have no idea what's going on.
Yeah, and so the person could come to you and say, "Yeah, my budget for water this year, it's it's 10x'd. We're pouring smart water on all the crops now in little bottles or something like that." And you're like, "Well, I guess that's how you water things now."
Right.
I don't know. Right? So you just wouldn't even understand what's going on.
Yeah, exactly.
So we need to wrap up now, but so Bryan Taylor, it's always just a great delight to see you and to chat with you, and certainly to hear. I think it's useful for our listeners and viewers to really kind of grasp, hopefully at another level, how you as a designer, and then how they as a founder who may be working with designers in at the right time in the right ways. Should be thinking about their brand in not just this narrow like colors and fonts and that sort of thing. Right. Yeah, that's part of it, but it's this broader experience.
Yeah.
And so I think that hopefully this conversation has been tremendously helpful to people along those lines. Again, as they're formulating their own framework for how they think about their business and their brand. So I just want to thank everybody who's watched and listened. Please tell your friends if you're getting a lot out of these conversations, then your peers and colleagues who are out there in the trenches with you, and they're maybe you're working late at night in a commercial kitchen or in a some kind of shared workspace. And you have other folks who could benefit from these conversations. Please subscribe, share, just kind of spread the word, and we appreciate your time, and we know it's valuable. And again, at Barcode, we're really just focused on equipping emerging consumer brands, and that's the spirit with which this conversation and all the other conversations that we're having are crafted. And so you can always learn more at barcodestartup.com. You go there and you can listen to all the back catalog of conversations we've had. You can listen to podcasts, you can read transcripts, and now you can watch videos. So however you best learn and best engage with this content, we've tried to make it available for you in that way. So until next time, thanks for joining us.